Okay, so let's get going. Welcome, everyone, to today's program, Rebuilding Debate, What Harvard Crimson Taught Us About Free Expression at Harvard. I'm John Evangelakos, the president of Harvard Alumni for Free Speech. Harvard Alumni for Free Speech is an independent, nonpartisan, and not-for-profit group formed for the purpose of protecting and promoting free expression, academic freedom, and viewpoint diversity throughout the Harvard-Radcliffe community. Today, Harvard Alumni for Free Speech is pleased to host a special program with two former chairs of the Harvard Crimson Editorial Board, Tommy Barone and Jacob Miller. Tommy and Jacob served as chairs of the editorial board between December 2023 through December 2024. And this past summer, they co-authored a widely read op-ed in the New York Times explaining various reforms that they implemented when they were head of the editorial board to improve the quality and the culture of deliberations. We're going to go on for about 45 minutes having a discussion. I'm going to pose some questions and just have a conversation with Tommy and Jacob. And we are going to provide some time for questions from the audience. So if any of you wants to have the question, please put it into the chat box and I'll try to monitor it, and time permitting, I'll pose it to Tommy and Jake. So with that, why don't we kick it off? First, could you guys just maybe spend a minute and just tell people who you are, explain what you were doing at Harvard aside from chairing the editorial board of the Crimson, and what you're doing now. So Tommy, why don't you kick it off?
Sure. First of all, thanks so much for having us. It's a pleasure to be here. And I think everyone on this call can agree that this is a really important issue that is both discussed a lot, but is maybe, at least I think in Jacob's, in my view, not always discussed in the right way, and is worth discussing better. I will begin my bio by saying that I am from a big Italian-American family in North Jersey, both because my big Italian-American family likes when I start with that, and also because I grew up in a household that was full of loud and noisy. You could call them debates. I might call them arguments, but I'm from a background where people disagreed. And then I went off to high school in the city, to a school called Regis High School. It's kind of left-leaning compared to where I came from. And that changed my point of view. It forced me to reckon with new viewpoints. And then I got to Harvard, where I majored in social studies. I was a resident of Currier House. And I joined the Harvard Crimson, which in many ways was my home away from home, which is easy when Currier House is your home because it's far from, everything. And so at the Crimson, I edited op-eds, I led the process to join the board. And then in my final year on the board, I was one of the two editorial chairs alongside Jacob. And obviously the point of this, webinar is to discuss some of the changes we made in that capacity. So I'll leave that for later. But now, just to kind of flash to the present, I am doing a master's degree in American history at Oxford on a Rhodes Scholarship, and I'm planning on returning to the U.S. right afterward to get into journalism.
That's terrific, Tommy. Thanks. Jacob, how about you?
Yeah, hi. Thank you for having us. It's really great to be here and to talk about such an important topic. I'm Jacob Miller. I am originally from Chicago. I come from an Orthodox Jewish family, and I went to Orthodox Jewish day schools all my life until I went to Harvard. I even, before Harvard, spent a year in Israel on a gap year program studying in yeshiva, which gave me a lot of perspective on a topic that would very soon become very salient on campus. And when I got to campus, I became very involved with Harvard Hillel. My sophomore year of college, I ran for Hillel president, and I was elected to that position. I served in that position for a year while I was on the Crimson. And then when that term ended, I became the editorial chair of the Crimson. And so I had these two kind of leadership positions on campus that both dealt with a lot of the tensions on campus, but from very different, in very different ways. When I was president of Hillel, I was representing the Jewish community and Jewish interests. Whereas when I was editorial chair of the Crimson, it was my job to publish perspectives on campus politics and campus tensions from all perspectives, including ones with which I disagreed and which I had kind of, denounced as president of Hillel. And so that was a challenge for me at first, but ultimately it was very rewarding. And it's something I anticipate we'll talk about a lot in this discussion. I graduated with a degree in math and economics, and I'm now doing a JD PhD, a PhD at Yale in economics, and a JD at NYU Law School.
Thank you. That's super impressive from both of you, and I can imagine you probably were not getting a lot of sleep when you were graduating. So with that, why don't we kick it off? I think I'm not sure how many people have read your piece, in the New York Times, but maybe we can just kind of go through some of those elements, and for people, maybe the two of you can sort of explain to us what struck you about the culture and the deliberations of the Crimson Editorial Board when you first joined.
I think actually this is something that we will have. Actually, we had quite different experiences of, so it's good that we're sort of both here to speak to them. I joined the editorial board in many ways as part of its consensus. So when I comped my freshman fall, I became a board member going into my freshman spring, and sitting on the editorial board, which, by the way, for those not familiar, it's a body of opinion writers. We meet 3 times a week for about an hour and a half each to talk about reporting, almost always from the news side of the Crimson. The meetings, consist of a fairly open discussion. At the end of the meetings, we reach a consensus on what we're going to write collectively. That we vote to reach that consensus, and then we draft the piece semi-collectively, and we publish it under a collective byline, which reads the Crimson Editorial Board. I joined the board as a pretty solid Democrat, a sort of someone solidly on the left, I would say, in a pretty average place for Harvard's campus. And I was, young and eager, and so I was very impressed, actually, in many ways, by the level of discourse happening on the board. I thought my fellow board members, particularly the leaders of the board, were curious, very intelligent people, a lot of fun and lively. And so I want to begin. I begin that way, both because that was genuinely my experience, and because I want to stress that my first impression, and in many ways the reality of the board when I joined it, was that people were having good, vigorous debates about things. The problem is that those debates were being had about how the dining halls could run better and what a better system for academic advising might look like, whether the gen ed curriculum was worthwhile or not, or some scandal of the week in one of Harvard's many consulting clubs. So when we were talking about easy issues, we could have really vigorous and rich discussions, and people on the board were earnestly interested in engaging with different perspectives on those issues. The problem, and this was a problem I didn't see for a long time, I want to openly admit, for probably at least a year, was that for those few issues, which became much less few, which became much more numerous in our tenure and before our tenure, somewhat before our tenure, that were controversial, that invoked identity in some way, that interfaced with broader national conversations that have become very acrimonious. That's when we'd have issues. But I'll again make clear that's not something that I saw at the beginning. Although I think Jacob has a somewhat different point of view on this.
Yeah, no, I think Tommy explained it pretty well. My perspective was a bit different because at least relative to campus politics, I was coming more from the center, and I was also more kind of sympathetic to conservative arguments, and I had a lot of friends who were conservative, some of whom had been on the board and become disillusioned by it, and so I was kind of very aware of the limits of our discussions on the board, and those weren't apparent when we were talking about kind of small stakes issues, but I think they were apparent in the kind of more significant discussions we had. And I think it just kind of manifested in a general sense that you know certain opinions were just kind of beyond the pale of what was kind of tolerated in those discussions. There was like an assumption that if you were in the room, you didn't have a kind of right of center opinion. And when people did express kind of countervailing viewpoints, and we say this in the article, I think people would respond in ways that weren't respectful and didn't actually engage the arguments that their peers were putting forth. So there was a lot of frowning and kind of eye rolling and and a lot of kind of ad hominem attacks on individuals who put forth arguments that fell outside the kind of left-wing orthodoxy. And this wasn't happening all the time. Again, like Tommy said, it was kind of in specific discussions, but it happened some of the time. And then, of course, kind of as campus politics became more tense, I think the dynamic became more apparent. Um, and so that was something that we tried to fix as chairs.
Mhm. Just, and I've heard this from other people, but was it just a handful of issues, or what was the range of issues that you couldn't really discuss, or it didn't we're not amenable to this kind of constructive dialogue?
We were
Yeah, I
discussing
mean,
issues.
no, you go, Jacob.
We were discussing issues 3 or 4 times a week, and so you can imagine that there were a lot of discussions in order to kind of have enough issues to discuss on kind of very, I don't want to say insignificant, but kind of politically non-salient issues. And so those kind of were not so acrimonious. Like Tommy said, we would discuss, issues pertaining to the dining services or academic advising, or curricular matters. But then, sometimes we were discussing kind of issues that were more controversial. So we had a number of meetings on affirmative action, for instance. Um, those were controversial. Obviously, kind of the Israel meetings were controversial. I think it would be safe to say that generally, when identity became involved, the meetings could become toxic. Um, I don't know if all the meetings that were toxic invoked identity, but that I would say that's a pretty good heuristic for when
Mhm.
meetings might lead to toxicity.
Yeah, I mean, I'll say off the top of my head, I actually do struggle to think of off the top of my head, not to say that this never happened, but I do struggle to think of meetings that became, in my view, unduly acrimonious and in which the climate of debate was less than open that did not involve identity in some way. And we talk about, I think all of the examples we talk about in the New York Times op-ed fit that trend,
Okay.
or fit that heuristic, as Jacob put it. The other thing I'll say, just by way of maybe creating a bit of a timeline for folks who are listening in, who either maybe haven't read the piece or have forgotten some of the particulars. Our freshman spring, so the semester, sort of midway through the semester, I had already joined the board, and in the semester that Jacob actually was still in the process of comping the board, of joining the board, the Crimson's editorial board endorsed the boycott, divestment, sanctions movement against Israel. And that's sort of, in a lot of ways, I think of that. I think there's actually really no way to tell the story that doesn't basically begin with that, because we faced an immense amount of backlash for that piece. And I think it caused a lot of introspection on the part of the board about, whether our practices were up to the task, whether um, in some way a more closed environment of debate than we would have liked. And I should say, actually, really, in that case, more so an environment that was homogenous, where there wasn't robust disagreement, because there weren't different viewpoints in the room in the first instance, that had in some way hidden risks that we had not fully apprehended. And I think that began for some of us a process of soul searching, which I think, speaking for both Jacob and myself, in many ways did culminate in the reforms that we made during our tenure.
Why don't we actually then transition from that? Maybe you could talk about the reforms that you implemented. And I know you give credit also to your predecessors, I guess, that started the process, but maybe just outline it. And again, some of these I think you've described them in the piece, but I'm not sure, as you say, everyone read the piece or remembers it, and how they actually aided the quality of your debate and discussion.
Yes. So we had two things that were helping us out, that I would say in many ways we didn't do anything to deserve, which is, first of all, that the semester before we became editorial chairs, a very significant number of staunchly and vocally pro-Palestine students and vocally and staunchly pro-Israel students comped the board.
Mhm.
So which on one hand, like it proved to be good because it meant that we had a diversity of opinions in the room to a degree that had not ever been the case before, or had not in our time on the board been the case. Um, but also it could have been a powder keg. And
Mhm.
um, we'll talk obviously more in a second about what the reforms were that ensured it would be a boon rather than a powder keg. The second thing that we benefited from was that the first couple of meetings after October 7th happened under our predecessors, and they did a good job, I think, easing us into it. Those were not easy meetings, but they were productive meetings in the end, and they resulted in editorials with which we were proud, with which we were satisfied, and that did, I think, shape the way people looked at Harvard in some really critical moments. This was for a sense of timeline before Claudine Gay had resigned, and significantly the discourse was surrounding pressure on her, and from our editorial board's point of view, pressure that was in many ways undue, unfair, and that ought to have been resisted, and that we tried to play a small part in resisting. I would say broadly, the thing to know about our reforms, which is I think captured in the piece, but not as plain spokenly as this, is that we basically just ask people to be normal. Like we just ask people to take a deep breath, level with each other, and have a sane and rational conversation. And something I want to stress, and maybe the most valuable thing that I think we could convey during this panel is that in many ways, dealing with the problems characteristic of, I mean, call it what you want, call it cancel culture, call it censoriousness, call it political correctness, whatever you want to call it. Dealing with those problems is not some rarefied, mystified thing. It is not rocket science. It's basically leaders being willing to take some criticism, to take it on the chin a little bit for a little while, and implement some common sense reforms that ask people to bring the temperature down and listen to one another. And it just requires a firm hand. And I honestly do think that part of the story here, these problems in the nation and in many institutions like the one that we led, is also that leaders are not willing to put themselves in harm's way a little bit and again take one on the chin, in pursuit of principles of better realizing principles that we all believe to be both important on a moral level and important for the proper functioning of many institutions.
Well, besides
And
asking people to be, oh, go ahead, Jacob.
okay, well, the one thing I was going to add is that I totally agree with Tommy on this, and that you do have to be willing to face a little bit of criticism. But I will also say that um, I think the board very quickly kind
Mm.
of not only fell in line, appreciate the approach. And so it wasn't even like we were kind of like, leading the board through this year of criticism where everyone on the board resented kind of the changes that we introduced. I think people actually really appreciated it and enjoyed having these discussions. And since then, people refer to the kind of the norms of discussion on the board in a very positive way. Um, and I don't think this is kind of something difficult you have to force on people. It's a bit difficult because you kind of sometimes have to break certain norms that are already in place in order to introduce new ones, and that can be uncomfortable, and people might at first resent that. But it wasn't really a difficult process, even in the kind of medium term.
Let's hold on for a second in terms of the heat you took, because I want to get back to that. But maybe aside from just asking people to be normal and listening to each other, big steps, which I applaud you on. But what other specific things did did
Yeah.
you do?
Yeah.
Again, I'm
So
just as advice for other leaders, I guess, who may be willing, who want to do this and may be willing to take the heat.
yeah, I'll briefly laundry list, and Jacob can fill in any holes that I leave. We got rid of laptops in meetings. People were not paying enough attention, and
How about
and
phones?
I mean, we discouraged phones, but like it was not considered legitimate, I think, at the outset, at the beginning of our tenure, to just be on your phone the whole time. Like that would have gotten you kind of, sideways looks. But to be on the kind of discourse was that being on your laptop was necessary because students at Harvard are so busy and we couldn't possibly ask them to, you know, go offline for an hour 3 nights a week.
Mhm.
And we said we don't care. And just quickly to dovetail on the thing that Jacob just said, people were so mad when we did that, and 1 week in, they admitted that it was great. That the level of discussion was so much higher, and people were so much more engaged, and the comments they were making were so much less redundant because they were
Mhm.
actually engaging with what was being said. So that's the first thing. We got rid of laptops. We moderated it, I would say, generally more actively. So we asked probing questions, we asked guiding questions, we did some pretty assiduous fact checking. I think all of which was somewhat of a change from what had been done previously. We stepped up requirements for how much our writers had to write. So we were asking for a higher level of commitment. Likewise, we asked that they come to meetings more routinely, with that being in the hopes that folks would come more often, understand our norms better, develop bonds of trust to a greater degree with other board members, and therefore be less likely to sort of get acrimonious or get sort of hot with them. Um, we encourage members to give shorter comments in general. We reduced the number of people who could write pitches, who could like write lists of bullet points that they thought the board should vote to say. And the idea for that was to reduce these sort of weird factional dynamics where people felt like their vote didn't just signal what they believed, but signaled who they stood with on the board in some manner. We asked people to write shorter pitches so that they were more focused. We asked people to read the pitches more closely. I would just say generally our principles were like greater engagement, greater focus, and closer attention. And now Jacob will fix whatever I screwed up there.
No, I think you basically covered everything. Nothing to add.
So, okay, well, I mean, sort of things I remember when I was practicing as a lawyer, sort of all good habits to train other lawyers with. But so you talked about heat. Is that so? You mean, and you talked a little bit about disagreement. Didn't sound like you had actually that much dissension once you implemented these.
I think so I think kind of the general norms. So let's say kind of like, banning laptops or I don't know, requiring people to have shorter comments, even just kind of like the like setting expectations about not kind of rolling eyes or muttering or frowning or whatever. Uh, those, I mean, some of those were initially met with some pushback, especially the laptops, but I think pretty quickly people accepted them. But then I think kind of when it came to actually enforcing some of these rules, there could be a little bit of friction. And you can imagine that if you're, if you are kind of trying to correct someone for speaking for too long or using kind of expletives in an opinion that they share, people could be resentful that you intervened or fact checking people, which is something we did pretty regularly and tried to do. People could be frustrated that we were intervening. I think whenever people felt that they were corrected somehow or that their kind of tone was corrected, they felt they took it personally sometimes and felt that it was our standards weren't being applied evenly. And I think that's kind of a natural reaction to experience when kind of someone superior to you on the board intervened the way that we did. So I understand that. And so it could be difficult to do those things. And but yet we felt it was important, and so we did it. And I think again, I do think there was kind of an understanding that these were important reforms, and maybe not every single person was satisfied every single day exactly how these were implemented, but I think we did a good job implementing them. And I think in some people probably appreciate what we did.
Yeah, I also, I guess what I would add to that is, and actually this is maybe an addendum also to the last thing I said about what we changed. In many ways, the most significant change to maybe specify the kind of slightly glib thing I said about asking people to be normal and sane, we sent out, like we sort of reinforced, adapted, and then more frequently talked about basically a set of expectations about decorum in the comments people would make. So we asked, as Jacob just alluded, we asked people not to make really any visible reaction that would signal disapproval or in some ways approval, to avoid kind of any social dynamic tilting in either direction for a given opinion. We asked people to not go on rants, to not raise their voices, to not, as Jacob also alluded, to use expletives. And we also, and this was, I would say, the single most difficult thing that we dealt with, we asked people to be mindful of the way they talked about their personal experiences and identity broadly. We tried to be very clear, and this was something that I think we were rightly criticized to do, pushed to do by some of our board members. We tried to be clear that it was important that people feel not just free to talk about their experiences, but in some way that they feel comfortable talking about their experiences, because that's incredibly important. I mean, the diversity of our editorial board, which was really significant, was one of our strengths in a really deep and true sense. At the same time, there are ways of talking about identity that can be that can really shut down a room and can freeze up dynamics, because you as a sort of well-meaning person who might not share in the experiences or in the identity group that a person has just talked about, don't want to be basically seen as rude for disagreeing with them either on the merits or sharing an experience that goes against theirs. And so something that we had to navigate was how to sort of thread the needle there. And what we ended up settling on was basically making it clear that people could express those opinions, but just asking that in general, people did not make comments in an emotional tone, that they tried to make it clear that there was room for disagreement. And when it seemed like the temperature was rising in the room, one of the things we would do as active moderators was to ask, to remind the room of our norms, to ask people to bring the temperature down. Sometimes if someone was really going off the handle, we'd interrupt them and say, hey, I know this is a difficult issue. We're just going to have to ask you to bring it down a couple notches. And when you intervened, I think those were the hardest situations. And what you had to do was just make it clear that it wasn't personal. You had to make sure you weren't gratuitous about it, but just sort of calmly and simply said, here are our norms, and let's keep them in view. And I think in general, something that really worked in our favor was that we talked sort of ad nauseum about our principles, including when things were going well. I mean, we spoke all the time about why we were making the changes we were making, why we believed that those changes were important. And I think that did have a way of gradually earning buy-in that really did, in many ways, reach across the ideological spectrum on the board.
So how did, I mean, I can see how that would improve the quality and the tenor of the discussion. How did it lead to a better editorial product? I mean, is it just that you had more people contributing and you had more viewpoints to kind of, assimilate into these pieces, or what was what do you attribute that, that to?
I would definitely say that that's kind of one avenue through which I would say that our editorials improved tangibly. More people, more perspectives were represented in the room, where people felt that they could share divergent perspectives, and so kind of the reasoning in our editorials engaged more with different perspectives, just because of the kind of change in dynamics as a result of our norms. But then some of the other reforms we introduced kind of more explicitly targeted improving the editorials we would eventually produce. So as Tommy mentioned earlier, we required people to read pitches more carefully. And then we instituted kind of a new kind of structure for the meetings, where after we had our discussion and after people pitched what they wanted our editorials to argue, we would debate those pitches, which didn't previously exist. And so people could then share kind of, in their view, what shortcomings of each pitch has had. And then kind of the pitch authors could improve the pitches to address those points. And then after we passed a pitch, we would again modify it to improve it. So I think whereas previously we kind of would have a discussion, people would write pitches and we would vote. Now we were grappling much more closely with what the pitch actually said. And I think because we insisted that people keep their comments brief and kind of cool and rational and unemotional, we were able to really kind of fine tune the pitches and identify their weaknesses, and kind of preempt criticism.
Mhm. No.
Yeah, and maybe the only thing I would add to that is that in many ways, I think the worst thing I would say an editorial could do, but also any piece of media that is endeavoring to persuade people, whether it be a speech or an ad or what have you. The worst thing that any persuasive product can do is be derisive or dismissive. There is really, I think, nothing worse than that. And in fact, if you are understanding an endeavor like that from the vantage point of persuasion, then it's almost nonsensical to be derisive or dismissive. It is a kind of tone or an approach that is ill-fitted to that aim, and that's something that I think was characteristic of some of our lower lights from the earlier period that we were on the board. And I think that something that you notice in many of our pieces from our tenure, and I certainly won't say this was true of all pieces, because big picture, like our editorial board remained liberal, which is fine. It's fine for an editorial board to have a perspective. It did not. We were not as diverse as with respect to politics in the nation broadly as we could have been. We were very diverse on one geopolitical issue and on some campus political issues, but not so much on national politics. And so I'm sure there were some contexts in which we were dismissive or derisive, but for a lot of other issues, and especially during our tenure, for the issues that really counted, where we were really being read, where we had an opportunity to shape the way that people looked at Harvard at a moment where it was really experiencing quite a bit of precarity, we were, I think, able to avert lazy argumentation, derisive argumentation, uncharitable argumentation, because we had people in the room always who genuinely affirmed the other position, and critically, who people in the majority in that meeting, even if it didn't include those people, thought were reasonable and good. And that has a way of making you almost feel embarrassed of being dismissive of other points of view.
No, let me actually use that. I'm going to want to pivot, I guess, at this point, and Tommy, just off of that, with a question for you, because I think you've written an editorial. I don't know if it was earlier this year about, I think, the importance of persuasive argument, and it was in the context, I think, of pro-Palestinian protests.
Yeah.
Just sort of as advice for students, editorial writers, but for anybody, how do you go about actually being persuasive and getting someone who doesn't necessarily agree with you to actually agree, to sort of at least accept or respect your position?
Yeah, so just for viewers' sake, the piece that John's referencing was an op-ed I wrote during the encampment. So that would have been something like a year and a half ago. It was during my junior spring, our first term, Jacob and mine, as editorial chairs. And I wrote a piece that was critical of the encampment, that argued that it was advocating for a cause that I think is in some ways just, but that is doing so so ineffectively, I think, as to be potentially even counterproductive, but certainly not as effectively as it could be. Which, from the vantage point of someone who, in some ways, directionally agrees with them, probably not to the same degree, but directionally agrees with them, is upsetting. And I guess the lessons I would offer maybe are twofold. First, I would say I am someone who earnestly believes, as I would own being a progressive, I would call myself a progressive. I earnestly believe that if you are not engaging in a mode of progressive politics that is persuasive, i.e., that cannot make progress, then you do not deserve to call yourself a progressive. I think that's it. Progressive people should make progress. And if you're doing something that is not capable of making progress, and frankly is not even tailored to making progress, you don't deserve to call yourself a progressive. That's first. The second thing I would say is that piece was just about perfectly calibrated to get everyone pissed off at me. It was openly critical of Israel and its conduct in Gaza, and it was extremely critical of the advocacy of pro-Palestine protesters at Harvard and to some degree in the country. And that is not a hypothetical statement. I know that it was perfectly calibrated to piss those people off, because the pro-Palestine people on Twitter totally canceled me for it. Like, I think something like 5 million people saw the tweet that I sent out, kind of publicizing the piece, and like 100 of them liked it, and like 500, quote tweeted it to like make fun of it, and like thousands of people were replying to it saying mean things about me, which was fine. And that's one of the lessons too. That's a sub lesson. Like, getting canceled on Twitter is fine. It's kind of funny. You should just laugh about it with your friends and not take it that seriously. And then some 3 months or 4 months later, I got an article sent to me from this kind of random online publication. It was this guy who had written an op-ed calling me an Israel basher and criticizing ABC News for hiring me for a summer internship. And so I was canceled from opposite directions for the same piece. And that might sound like, well, then that's not, clearly this wasn't good advice. Like, why would you write a piece like that? But what I'm getting to is there is some real importance, I actually think, in being honest about your convictions and in having strong convictions. And while there are loud minorities on both sides that really disliked that piece, I know for a fact that that piece represents actually a strong majority, I think, of students on campus. And I would wager that it represents a really significant portion of people in the country. And I feel good that that piece was widely circulated, in part because it caused outrage. And I think it was able to make a difference because it was strongly convicted and because I didn't, talk around what I believe.
So how do you, I mean, you have to have the truth of your convictions and be willing to face the
Yeah,
consequences.
yeah,
But, just how do you, I mean, I think part of it, you made
yeah, yeah,
allusions to it. You don't deride people, you don't make fun of people's positions. I think
yeah,
I had, I remember you basically, what I recall is you provide, you have to be sympathetic and help understand, or you don't have to agree, but you at least have to understand, where people are coming from. So
yeah.
anyways, I'd be curious for your perspective.
Yeah, I would say, yeah, it's a good question. I would, I think you have to take counter arguments seriously, and that's like a basic principle of argumentation,
Mhm.
but it's true. You should not just take them seriously, but you should try to construct the strong version of your counter arguments,
Mhm.
and you should engage with those. You should reason from facts, because facts are something that people, I mean, ideally can't just throw out the window. And then the final thing I would say, I something I spoke about ad nauseum also on the board, and Jacob's going to roll his eyes at this, is like reasoning from first principles. I talked about it constantly for like 3 years. I think most debates happen significantly below the level of first principles, at least feels reasonable to people, even if it's not
Mhm.
something they ultimately agree with.
Right. Thank you for that. So Jacob, why don't we turn to, I guess, one of your prior op-eds here? And I guess, instructive in a different way, that you had written about how disillusioned you were, going back to the 2022 boycott, divestment, sanctions endorsement by the Crimson. Yet you stuck through it, and went onto the editorial board, became one of the chairs. What it's a very, it's a very personal journey, but can you share with us your thought process, why you wrote the piece, and what would you advise someone, um, when should they sort of disengage because they're so unhappy and dissatisfied, and how should they continue, um, trying to convince people, or to sort of continue talking to people you disagree with, or people you actually think may hate you. So, Jacob, I mean, there's a lot to unpack there, but I'll let you do that.
Yeah, sure. That piece was a pleasure to write, and I think I'll explain why I thought it was important to write. When I initially was deciding whether to run for the position of editorial chair, it was a very difficult decision for me. And it was partly difficult because uh, October 7th had just happened, and I was so busy kind of responding in my capacity as Hill president. I felt didn't even have time to consider whether or not I wanted to take this job, which I knew was a big time commitment, and would prevent me from kind of doing other things on campus. And make kind of academic life more difficult just because of the sheer amount of time required to do the job. But the other reason it was difficult was because I felt very emotionally affected by everything that was happening on campus. And I really did feel like kind of abandoned by a large part of the campus community. And that my worth was in some ways discarded by kind of the really, I think, vitriolic things that some people in the pro-Palestine movement had said, and which weren't receiving the level of condemnation I had hoped that they would. And I just felt very kind of emotionally abandoned, and I felt that I was doing really important work for the Jewish community as Hill president. And I felt that if I became chair of the Crimson editorial board, I knew that if I took that position, I wouldn't use it as kind of a position to just further my own narrow agenda with regards to Jews in Israel on campus. I felt that would be unfair. And I knew if I did the job, I would have to do it in earnest, and really seek to kind of publish all perspectives and fulfill the function that I believe a liberal newspaper's opinion section should, which is kind of, curate diverse perspectives so that readers can form their own opinions. And I thought that was going to be difficult for me emotionally because I was just kind of so caught up in everything on campus, and I felt personally implicated. And I felt kind of the distance required to do the job would be difficult for me to attain. And ultimately, I decided to run for the position. And it ultimately became very fulfilling for me. And I wasn't anticipating that. I thought it might be socially fulfilling. I thought it could be kind of professionally fulfilling. I might learn to be a better editor, but I didn't anticipate it being kind of fulfilling in the same way that being Hill president was. And I think I mentioned in the piece that midway through my tenure, I read this article in The Atlantic by Franklin Foer about kind of how the American Jewish community had been protected by liberal norms in America, and how those have kind of increasingly become under attack from both the left and the right. And I felt that playing out in front of me on the Crimson, because there were people on the right, pro-Israel students, who would come to me and ask me, why did you publish this pro-Palestinian op-ed? And couldn't fathom why I felt it was important, even as a pro-Israel Jew myself, to have different viewpoints represented. And then, kind of simultaneously, there were people on the left in the pro-Palestine movement who wanted to cancel the Crimson for kind of doing, I think, very basic kind of reporting work. And I just felt kind of very, very disillusioned by what I viewed as illiberal elements on both sides of the political aisle, not really understanding what the purpose of a newspaper opinion section is. And I began to feel that if we can kind of continue to offer I began to feel that it was in the Jewish community's interest, it was in everybody's interest, to have a newspaper that allows people to reach their own opinions, and that prioritizes debate and discussion, civil debate and discussion. And that wasn't actually counter to what I had been doing as Hill president. It was, it was also a noble idea. And so I ultimately felt very fulfilled by the position. I wanted to make that case and explain that journey for me. And that's kind of what that op-ed sought to do.
I'm glad you stuck with it. It's a couple, maybe one or two final questions here, because I think we're kind of coming to the end of our time here. But do you think can you extrapolate what you did at the Crimson to Harvard, or is it just a matter of scaling, or is the Crimson and Harvard just two different creatures, or Crimson is its own small thing and Harvard is just big and diverse, and you can't even sort of figure out what's happening there. Did you ever think about that, or are there?
I think, yeah, this is certainly something we've discussed, Jacob and I, sort of, privately. I think that it does generalize and can scale with two caveats. The first caveat is that the people who are on the editorial board, even if they weren't always, even if we as a collective, and I say we because I was part of this certainly, even if we weren't always doing the best job to facilitate an open environment for inquiry and debate, we were people who had self-selected into a community that or an organization that is premised on, in some way, open dialogue and debate. So we were people who were showing up, who were coming to the table, and that's not necessarily true of the campus community as a default. I don't think that they're hostile to that idea, but I think that they need to be invited and encouraged, maybe in some ways forced to do that. That's the first thing I'd say. The second difference is that there have been obviously many efforts in the last 3 years to facilitate open inquiry on campus that reaches the sort of wider campus community. Those have happened significantly under the mantle of this intellectual vitality initiative, which I think is certainly worthwhile. But there is, I think, a hope, really, because it's a lever that's there to be pressed, that kind of dialogue can happen significantly in the context of class sections, like small group discussions pursuant to courses. The problem with that is that a vanishingly small proportion of classes are in any way centrally about the issues of the day that actually engender sharp disagreement, acrimoniousness, censoriousness, etc. And so I think there's a way of trying to shoehorn intellectual vitality into contexts where it really isn't germane, and where it's difficult to teach it because it's not being in some way tested. And so I think the challenge for the university is how to make people that are not seeking out opportunities for dialogue like this, which reality check is like the vast majority of students, to enter environments where that is happening, and furthermore to be having to discuss issues that are genuinely challenging And to do so, finally, I'll say in a moderated setting, 'cause I do think moderation is really a key part of the story. And in some ways, it's unfair to ask, or at least it's not obviously sensible to ask, teaching fellows, for example, who are ultimately graduate students in a given area, to moderate difficult discussions, which, as Jacob and I learned, is on one hand, easier than you might think, but on the other hand, it is certainly a skill that needs to be cultivated, and that isn't trivial.
The one thing I'd add to that, and I totally agree with everything Tommy said, is that I think there's also another kind of difference between the work we were doing at the Crimson and kind of what some sort of scaled version of this would look like at the university, which is at the Crimson, we had a very clearly defined and tangible end product we were trying to produce. We were trying to put out editorials that were persuasive and engage different perspectives. And so for one thing is I think it was very clear to people why it was important to have kind of civil discussion that went into those meetings that produce those editorials in order to produce more persuasive and better reasoned editorials. The other thing is I think people felt like real stakes, and people felt that by expressing their opinions, they could in some way shape an editorial that was going to go out and be read by hundreds, if not thousands of people. And that really motivated people to engage with the discussion, even when it was difficult for them, even if they were in the minority. And I don't think that element or that incentive would exist in kind of a scaled version of this, where people are just kind of discussing controversial topics for the sake of it, so that they kind of become better at disagreement. That doesn't mean that it's impossible, but I think one of the kind of special features of the Crimson is that it created this incentive structure that really pushed people to share their perspectives, and it was very transparent to people why it's important to greet other perspectives with civility.
That's terrific. Well, we've gone over time, so I appreciate you both sticking with it here. This has been a fascinating discussion. I've learned a lot. I really enjoyed talking with both of you, and I very much appreciate your taking the time, to do this program. Really, thank you very much, and I wish you continued success with whatever you do.
Thanks so
Thank you
much.
so much.
Take care. Bye-bye. Good
Bye.
night.